Ladies and gentlemen, if I could, I'd like to ask us to reconvene. If I can call up Dr. Chano and our other panelists. We may not be Heizo Takanaka, but between the four of us, we'll hope to add a closing oomph to our discussions today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Junko Chano, the Executive Director of the Sasaka Peace Foundation, the President of the Sasaka Peace Foundation, USA. It really gives me great pleasure to be here with you for the conference on the progress of Abenomics. This is part of our collaborative project with the Peterson Institute, that is to organize a high-level working group to study common economic issues that face the United States and Japan. And in this panel, we are going to talk about TPP and trade issues. We have three outstanding speakers here. To my immediate left is Dennis Blair. Of course, he's the chairman and the CEO of the Sasaka Peace Foundation USA. He has been a great boss for me. But also yesterday, the former Senator Webb described him to be a classic example of a soldier scholar. And he was a Rhodes Scholar, studied at Oxford University, and also served the US Navy for 34 years. But in Japan, he's been really well known as the Commander-in-Chief of US Pacific Command. So he's going to talk about trade and security issues. And then we have Jeff Schott, and he's been also a regular speaker whenever we work together with Peterson Institute. And he's a senior fellow of Peterson Institute and specialized international trade issues and economic sanctions. And then our anchor is our Adam, and I'm really happy to be working with him. Right after he became the president of the Peterson Institute, we have started working with him on several projects. And the first project, I think, was the also a conference on TPP, and also Professor Heizo Takenaka was the keynote speaker. So with these three wonderful speakers, we are going to start discussions on trade issues. So Dennis, please.
Oh, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. And when I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, I felt that my job was to manage the security issues in the background of the security architecture in the Pacific, just keep the balance of force favorable to the United States and its allies, try to nip potential crises at the lowest possible moment, forestall them if possible. And that if I could just, with the military forces, hold the ring, then the good things that would happen in the Asia-Pacific region, continuing that great economic and social and political progress that started following the Second World War, would be the business of businessmen, economists, and those who were doing business, because military transactions by their nature are win-lose. I mean, somebody comes out on top and somebody doesn't. Whereas economic transactions are win-win. There has to be a willing buyer and a willing seller. It's what moves societies up and what moves human welfare up. So I very much tried to stay in the background and then to cheer for those of you who are working in the business, commercial, economic area, who I felt were the ones who could really create the wealth that would enable the great accomplishments we've seen in that part of the world. However, I also learned that you can't separate those two spheres, the security, geopolitical, military sphere, completely from the economic sphere, and that particularly in Asia, a large part of the general feeling about national influence, power, and especially how things will go in the future derives as much from economic business prowess as it does from military prowess. I don't think it was any coincidence at all that it was after the recession that started in the United States with our real estate bust spread around the world that attitudes in Asia changed, and that China that took prompt large stimulus action was widely seen to have pulled many other different Asian countries out of the worst effects of that depression, was in fact doing well, the United States doing badly. And you could almost feel attitudes in Asia change in ways that affected not just economic issues, but general security and geopolitical issues. So I really do think that the that the TPP has more than simply economic aspects to it. The history of the Asia-Pacific region is that the bones, the framework, the architecture, both in the military and economic side, have been established by the United States and then its powerful allies and trading partners, chief of which is Japan, but Korea, Taiwan, others in the region, and that by with the underlying military balance, making aggression not worthwhile, but then by a set of rules that sort of regulated finance, international trade, and openness of markets. This U.S.-led and established framework was the real key to positive future of the region, and that U.S. Leadership of that entire framework has been slipping since that last recession. And I think that for me, the TPP is really the reestablishment of the principles that democratic, open countries believe in terms of their economic and business affairs, and that its success will really set the United States, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, countries that feel as we do that democratic governments and open markets are really have the right idea, and that the competition, the mercantilist, state-planned, heavy SOE, Chinese method is not the way that will lead to the greater prosperity of the region. So I don't regard this as just a competition with China so much as I regard it as a renewal of the American leadership of the fundamental architecture in Asia that has benefited many countries there and the United States. The United States itself. The internal, there are many people in the room who know a lot more than I do about what difference it will make in narrow economic terms. But I think that from the security point of view, it will just create a sense of momentum, a sense of support for the basic principles of open markets, high standards, development that the United States and other countries agree in. And I think that it should be done in an open manner. I would draw a contrast, for instance, to the sort of spectacle we've seen about the AIIB, in which the American approach has been somewhere between churlish and grudging, depending on the day, and really belying the principles that we said we stood for in terms of those who can bring investment money to the table and are committed, certainly rhetorically and eventually in reality, to doing it in accordance with international standards are most welcome. And I think that it will be very important for a renewed style of American leadership to keep the TPP open to China, to other countries, not to treat it as a group of just the United States and its close allies and all, but to treat it as a pattern setting a pattern for Asia. And if we can do that, then I think we take a huge step forward to the Asia that we all seek, which is an Asia that is big, that has room for many different countries, that can benefit all, that is not a zero-sum game. It's not a set of Bismarckian, Metternickian billiard balls that are bouncing off each other, but is in fact creating greater prosperity in which many can share. And to me, that's really the long-term significance of it. So to our USTR negotiators and their colleagues, whenever I felt that my job was hard, I would just sort of look across at them and and I'd feel great. However, your worst day in the armed forces is probably better than your medium-sized day as a trade negotiator. But so we wish them all the best, and especially the political leadership on top of it that's required to sort of push that ball over the goal line in the last rush here in the next few months, we hope. And then instead of doing high fives in the end zone, let's turn around and make this a wider architecture available to many different countries.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to join colleagues from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation again. A great honor for me to be on the panel with Admiral Blair. Well, we worked together about a month ago in a program the foundation sponsored on Capitol Hill to help inform the debate on TPP among staff members of the Senate and the House, and I think the foundation is doing excellent work trying to raise these issues and encourage debate. I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about TPP and its impact on Japan's medium and long-term growth strategy. We have written a lot here at the Institute about this, but let me summarize a few points that I think are particularly important at this stage of the negotiations, which are nearing the finish line, and could, Congress willing, and with the skill of our hardworking trade negotiators, conclude sometime this summer. The first point is that with all the discussion of Abenomics this morning, the TPP certainly would support the third arrow. It would help Japan advance its domestic economic priorities by spurring policy reforms that create a more attractive environment for new investment and enhance the competitiveness of domestic firms and workers. Now, the TPP doesn't require, but I think gives strong impetus to many of the structural reforms that are needed, that are under consideration in Japan. So I think in that sense, in some ways it contains some obligations, but in many ways it creates encouragement for moving forward on the broad economic strategy. In this regard, it also propels some of these reforms through another aspect of the TPP. It would be a de facto U.S.-Japan free trade agreement, something that we have talked about for a long time. It's been on the agenda of Institute meetings since the late 80s, after the U.S.-Canada agreement was promulgated, and talks about extension had come about, but it always had run aground on a variety of economic and political obstacles. And this would allow the United States and Japan to move forward with the type of partnership, economic partnership, and reform that I think will benefit both economies. Certainly, the U.S. and Japan have common interests and are working together very closely to ensure that the TPP has strong investment and intellectual property rules. That point often gets drowned out in the discussions of our bilateral negotiations on market access on agriculture and autos. But for much of the broad range topics on the TPP agenda, the United States and Japan are working arm in arm to seek a very high standard agreement. The TPP is writing the rules for the international trading system for the 21st century. The president has it a bit off in his message, saying if we don't write the rules, the Chinese will write the rules. The Chinese are not writing rules. They're not being written anywhere else. The Chinese and the other Asian integration arrangements are basically just doing partial or shallow integration arrangements that rely on existing WTO rules. There is no new rulemaking being undertaken in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. If there are going to be new rules to guide and address the new challenges of the 21st century trade and investment, it's going to come in TPP. Unfortunately, the WTO process, which could take on that responsibility, has been slow moving. And indeed, one of the hopes would be that the TPP would set precedents that then could revive and reinvigorate interest in taking those precedents and moving them to the broader multilateral platform. Certainly, the TPP is critical in that regard, and the U.S. and Japan are working closely on many of those issues. Market access negotiations on agriculture and autos are moving forward. They attract most of the attention of the press. I think it was very good, Adam, that you raised that point with Heizo Takanaka. He answered it with regard to agriculture, though even there, he noted the problems of reform, but essentially reform is being negotiated, even if it is somewhat incomplete. But incomplete reform on these most sensitive issues still means very substantial liberalization and deep enough liberalization to create commercially meaningful new trading and investment opportunities. And so I think sometimes trade negotiators get hung up with the thought that you have to go and totally eliminate tariffs. That obviously it would be the ideal endpoint, but it also can be meaningful to substantially reduce tariffs in the most politically sensitive areas if it is done to a sufficient extent so that it allows an increase in trade over existing levels. And so I think in some of the products under negotiation, there are 5 main product categories, but really about 500 tariff lines. So it is a large area of bilateral trade in agricultural products. I think the negotiators have made very, very good progress. I think they are very close to concluding a deal that will be beneficial for both countries. On autos, I think there it is a question of both providing some security that there will be fair access, not on the tariff front, which is not really a problem for either country, but with regard to non-tariff measures. And I think there has also been meaningful progress made so that we can continue to have a very strong relationship in this sector as we've had in the past. The TPP is not just between the United States and Japan, and it will also help solidify the reforms in the Japanese economy because it's also going to deepen Japan's interactions with the other 10 TPP countries. In many of those countries, Japan already has trade agreements, but those trade agreements are not as comprehensive as the TPP, nor and they often have many more exceptions to liberalization than the TPP. So the TPP will help upgrade and deepen the liberalization of Japan's existing free trade agreements, and that in turn will have knock-on effects for the reform process in Japan. It will also help in cases where it'll also help deal with the problem that Japan currently faces, which is that it faces some discrimination from being outside of the tent of important regional trading arrangements, particularly the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement that has now entered its third year and gives Korean exporters and investors some advantages in the U.S. market over their Japanese competitors. So this will level the playing field in that regard. Overall, I think we have looked at what the basic broad impact on welfare and trade would be once the whole agreement is fully implemented. This obviously would take some time. If the agreement is signed this year, it will still take time for it to enter into force because it will require ratification of the member countries, and then the transition of some of the most sensitive products, which would take 3, 5, 10, even 20 years for the most sensitive products to achieve full liberalization. Indeed, this longer time frame, I should note, is being given to some of the agricultural products, and this is unusual for the United States. I think Japan, given the political difficulty that Japanese politicians have in addressing the concerns about agricultural liberalization, the United States negotiators, I think, are going to end up giving more partial exemptions to agricultural reform in the TPP than they have in previous trade agreements. But on the understanding that the type of reforms that are being pursued will yield new opportunities. So I think that's an important indication that the two sides are working together very closely and are accommodating their basic concerns so that trade will be a win-win, as Admiral Blair said. What this means as a bottom line is, as we have discussed in previous meetings of this kind, based on the work of Peter Petrie and his colleagues, is that Japan, with the full implementation of these reforms, would clearly gain from participation in the TPP. With full implementation, Japan could see a boost to its GDP of about 2%, and that's a huge gain. I often say the U.S. benefits would be about 0.4% of GDP, and 0.4% of GDP is a very, very big number. It doesn't sound big if you're thinking of it just as an arithmetic term, but in terms of actual output, it's a very, very big number. For the United States and Japan, they would count for about more than 60% of the benefits of the total increased output of the TPP 12 once the deal is concluded. So it's very clear that the TPP would be a big win for the United States and Japan. but only if the United States and Japan work together to get to the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you all for sticking it out through the last panel, and thanks again to my colleagues, but particularly to Junko and Dennis, who've been real stalwarts in our partnership to keep common issues of Japan and U.S. on the front burner of analysis. Let me pick up on something which I think is, as with so many things, starts with a U.S.-Japan aspect but becomes a general issue, and that's the question of currency and so-called manipulation. What we've seen is some very ugly resurrection of Japan as the boogeyman by people who were Carter-era officials, people who own large houses in Detroit, and Arthur Laffer. And this kind of initiative is not helpful. It's not helpful mostly because it's bad for the U.S. And so let me try to explain why it's bad for the U.S. Because it's ultimately talking about a currency war is a phony war. And to whatever degree there's been a war, it's already over. So spoiling our trade negotiations and our relationships with our allies for something that didn't really exist is a very poor idea. Start off with the idea of trade manipulation, currency manipulation in Japanese trade. Since April 1st, 2004, Japan's Ministry of Finance has intervened in currency market a grand total of 11 times. Most of those occasions took place immediately following the great earthquake and tsunami and the nuclear accident, under complete agreement and coordination with its G7 partners. There was one intervention later that year in 2011. Japan's G7 partners, including the US, complained. Japan immediately stopped. I remember discussing with the Vice Minister of Finance, Mr. Watanabe, who took over in April 2004, when they decided to stop doing large-scale currency intervention. And I'm not going to quote him because my memory is not perfect of our conversation at the time, but essentially it was, well, come on, we woke up. This is something that is self-defeating for Japan, both politically and economically. And that, in a sense, is the big message, that country after country that's engaged in this, with the exception of a couple small countries I'll come to, has basically decided this is a self-defeating behavior. We can see this right now with China as well. China had been egregiously intervening in exchange rate markets in the early 2000s against the dollar, as my colleagues Morris Goldstein, Nick Lardy, and Fred Bergston pointed out. At that time, it was running a 10% of GDP trade surplus. In the years since, as China has grown in sophistication and depth as an economy, as it has seen its role in the world economy go up, as it's seen its political vulnerabilities go up, as it has matured, China has cut back repeatedly and forcefully on its extent of currency intervention, and in fact has basically been in diplomatic accord with the US government over the last couple of years. It is interesting to note that at the moment, even as China slows down, it has chosen to barely intervene in the currency market. It has chosen to intervene in very small amounts, approximately a 20th of the scale that it was intervening in 10 years ago. And that, of course, is against an economy that is roughly 4 times the size. Premier Li gave a sense of statements on stimulus for the Chinese economy. He mentioned a number of domestic measures. He said nothing about the exchange rate. Similarly, you heard Heizo Takanaka speaking largely on behalf of the Abe administration today. He gave a list of Abenomics interventions and the needs for change in Japan. The exchange rate was not mentioned once. Grown-up countries realize this is self-defeating. And a grown-up US should realize the best way of doing things is to encourage countries to come to that realization and do so through diplomacy and not through idle threats that cannot be implemented anyway. Now, there's a lot of garbage being put out there by various interest groups, I don't need to name them, making various claims about Japan. Of course, the yen has depreciated enormously over the last few years. Most of us would suggest that that has something to do with quantitative easing. that would seem to be the cause, just as it was relating to the US dollar in 2008, 2009. But while the yen has declined by a huge amount, depending on the day, the Japanese trade surplus has gone into deficit. The Japanese bilateral trade surplus with the US has barely moved. Japanese foreign exchange reserves have not risen a penny since December 2011. Now, there is a bad report out there by the EPI which suggests that, Japanese have accumulated huge reserves, so we know they're intervening. But of course, they play the sleight of hand by adding up those reserves in yen terms. The actual amount of reserves hasn't changed. They've simply gone up in nominal terms in yen. There is nothing going on. There is nothing to see here. Moreover, when we look at the Japanese situation, including in such sensitive areas as the auto industry, there is very little correlation between Japan's market share in the US auto market and the yen rate. I realize that seems counterintuitive until you start really thinking about it. That people make choices about autos in part as durable goods based on brand, on quality, on convenience, on reputation. That in the end, 70% of Japanese auto manufacturing, 70% of the value of all autos sold in the US is manufactured in the US by Japanese firms. By the fact that, as with American firms like GM, Caterpillar, United Technologies, and others, a huge share of what goes on is supposed to be exposed to exchange rates is actually transfer pricing within a company. And generally, these major companies retain their prices in local currency terms and either eat or gain those changes over time. And if anything, we have seen Japanese companies increasingly engage in this behavior over the last 5 years. The Japanese share of the US auto market has been flat for the last 5 years, even as the exchange rate has moved massively. We sometimes hear claims from various industries that Japanese autos in particular, have an unfair advantage because they have a closed market in Japan, and that generates huge revenues, which then can be used for R&D and other kickbacks, not kickbacks, side payments to customers. Of course, this is factually incorrect in the sense that, A, we know that Toyota and Honda did much lower incentives to customers over the last 10 years by a huge factor in terms of frequency or size than GM, Ford, or Chrysler. And more importantly, we know that over the last few years, the big three US automakers have sat on huge piles of cash, far dwarfing any claims about the amount of gain in the Japanese auto market that they could choose to put into R&D or to marketing if they want, but they have chosen instead to sit on the cash or return it to shareholders. That is their right. That's perfectly reasonable. But when you sit on a cash pot of $5 billion, to complain about you can't keep up with a supposed R&D subsidy of $100 million seems a bit absurd. I think it's also important, though, to get beyond the Japan specifics and understand why repeatedly responsible US Treasury officials in both parties, Geithner and Paulson, for example, have refused to name China a manipulator and have generally pursued a diplomatic course rather than trying to create rules and threats about exchange rates. The basic idea is you're dealing with other sovereign countries, and you're dealing with them across a range of agenda items. And you have to ask how much you're going to poison relationships by rattling your sword, and you have to ask yourself how much damage you do to your own country when you do something like that. We know, as I said, that the Chinese behavior on terms of currency intervention has changed massively in the last dozen years. I admit that in 2004, I was, along with some of my colleagues, complaining to then Treasury Secretary, I guess it was Paulson. What, sorry? Which one? Snow. Oh, Snow. I always forget about him. Snow. Sorry. That, why aren't you calling China out? And instead, what we've seen is a succession of diplomatic initiatives that have led to Chinese changing this behavior without a direct cost to the US and without an escalation or spillover into other areas. This actually, in the context where we have today repeatedly, and I think justifiably, criticized the Obama administration for their handling of the AIIB, they deserve great credit for their deft economic diplomacy, first under Undersecretary Brainerd and now under Undersecretary Sheets, that in late 2012, we had an explicit agreement in the G7 not to have intervention unilaterally against each other's currencies, and that was immediately used to keep Japan in line. And then we extended this agreement informally at the latest G20 summit of economic deputies. Until we created this AIIB notion, the Chinese government had largely gone along with this, and we have not seen the kinds of interventions. Now, I realize I'm about to ask the impossible, but imagine a congressperson in the US who actually thinks other countries exist, okay? You're another country. If you're the US, and you sit there and you say, I hate extraterritorial rules. I hate all these people with their black helicopters imposing rules on my guns, on my environment, on my food. And yet, we, the US, are going to tell a small country like a Vietnam, a developing country like an Indonesia, that we are going to impose upon them a constraint on their ability to ride out the basic macroeconomic cycles in the world. What arrogance, what short-sightedness. This is a poison pill that is sure to kill any future trade agreement, whether it's TPP or not. It also is an absurd concept to think that somehow a Singapore, a Hong Kong, is somehow exploiting the US. That remains, of course, the great myth of all this and goes back to the Japanese boogeyman and the mercantilist view of trade I spoke about earlier. The idea has always been, since the Carter era, or for that matter, actually since Connolly and Nixon, let's start there, that the US has somehow been the victim of international economic trends, that we somehow were always getting taken for a ride by these pernicious foreigners who were playing games with their exchange rate, were blocking our exports. And yet, on every gravity model, the extent of trade that the US has and the extent of ownership that the US has and the extent of inward investment that the US has far exceeds anything that the fundamentals would have. On any economic model, the investment in US reserve currency, US denominated assets, the interest rate benefits we get from being the reserve currency far exceed any other country, especially controlling for our trade deficits. This ongoing sniping, as though even if it were relevant today, the idea that Japan somehow put one over on us back in 1982 or 86, and somehow there never would have been any foreign automobile sales in the US today if only we had gotten past their trickery, that somehow Detroit would still be making everything as it did in 1948, if only we hadn't gotten rid of these terrible, if only we had gotten rid of these terrible trade blocks. The idea that the US, which has had decades of outperformance given its low savings rate, low investment rate, on productivity growth, mostly because we allow competition from abroad and have globalized, would have fallen behind and had noticeably higher employment on average if we had simply stood up to these pernicious foreign forces is patently absurd. And yet that is the vision that the opponents of TPP and many of the advocates of currency manipulation legislation have for us. It is a pessimistic vision, it is a distorted vision, it is an unfounded vision. And it's time for us to get past that. Fundamentally, this does not let Japan off the hook. Picking up on Jeff's presentation, I would just say that we are at the point where the Prime Minister of Japan and his government must fish or cut bait, as the saying goes, on agriculture. As Jeff has noted, the US government has come out and has made offers to Japan, we don't know the details, but we know basically, that do not require zero tariffs in pork, that do not require complete opening of the dairy market in Japan. but simply requires significant progress, enough to make it worthwhile for US congresspeople from the wrong states to get on the right side. The Prime Minister of Japan, for all his talk, has failed to deliver on this. And it's fine for Heizo Takanaka to say it's like the NRA, and I understand that that is a very damning comparison. But the bottom line is, when President Obama went to Tokyo after Vice President Biden stood up in the security sense for Japan over the islands, which Admiral Blair knows well, Prime Minister Abe failed to deliver on agriculture. When Prime Minister Abe came to the US and had a last summit in Washington with President Obama, he made promises on agriculture and again failed to deliver. For all my wanting to get rid of the nonsense of currency manipulation arguments, and especially to step away from the idea of Japan as boogeyman, either past or present, the responsibility of the Abe government for their own people, as well as for broader US-Japan relations, mandates that they do have to make the deal. They will not get another chance at this deal anytime soon. And just to drive home something that I said, if I may make one last comment, at a previous Sasakawa PIIE joint event, were Japan to liberalize its agricultural markets, it would immediately deliver roughly $1,500 a year to every household in Japan. This is equivalent to a very large tax cut and a very large stimulus. It reminds us that trade deals are not about opening the other person's market. It's about getting the gains to the consumers in your market and putting the competitive pressures on your market. And when we look at Japan's failings of the last 20 years economically, it goes with the fact that they did not liberalize sufficiently. That's one recurring message of today's conference. Let Japan take TPP as that opportunity to liberalize. Let us encourage that in the US by not engaging in false claims about currency manipulation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations, and I think we got so many good themes, and I'm so amazed that just only on TPP and we can talk from so many fronts and so many implications. And so, therefore, I'd like to open the floor immediately for questions. And because each of you have spoken on different fronts, you may want to specify who you would like your questions to be answered. So, is anyone who'd like to start? Oh, yes, the gentleman.
You're ever present.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Stimulating talks by everybody. Both Adam and Jeffrey, I have one question. It's one thing to criticize a congressman who doesn't hold a passport. What about a Nobel Prize winner economist who specializes in trade, who suggests that the gains from TPP are not all that great and that the rewards go to monopoly interests?
Economists are often wrong, and even Nobel Prize winning economists can often be wrong, even the one you were mentioning. I think it's important at some point to just ask about the basic logic, which is going back to the Corn Laws in 19th century Britain. Trade liberalization has been associated with breaking down established oligopolies and breaking down entrenched power bases. Now, there are some, I don't know if legitimate, but at least concerning issues being raised with respect to ISDS and issues of intellectual property rights, which Jeff is better prepared to address than I am. So the specifics of the deal would matter. But the idea that the people of Japan or Vietnam or Indonesia or even Singapore would somehow have less entrenched corporate patriarchies if they were to not engage in freer trade with the US seems absurd. And the idea that the US would not stand to gain from helping these democracies around the world get more liberalization seems to me also absurd. So I ended up fighting with Joe Stiglitz, for example, about Scottish independence a few months ago. Joe is, 5 standard deviations beyond my IQ, and his contributions to economic policy and economic analysis are incredible. But he was just fundamentally wrong. He had an ideological view based on a fantasy that, any small country can go ahead and go out there and it doesn't really matter because everyone will be nice to them. Similarly, there are people who have ideological views that the game is skewed right now. And somehow it's the availability of alternative markets in the US that have skewed the game. And that strikes me as, at best, a secondary explanation. It's just like when Hazel was talking about 90% of Japanese not wanting immigration. There was a paper presented at the Brookings Papers last week under our friend Justin Wolfer's editorship, which shows a vast majority of Americans don't want to see redistribution. That's the reason we have the society we do. That's the reason why corporates continue to accumulate power and wealth, because there is a politically effective majority in this country that likes it that way. It's not because of trade.
Let me just add one point to that. Adam made the important point that the details can matter in how the agreements are assessed by people who are very busy and may not have time to actually look beyond the bumper stickers. And I think in the case of our famous New York Times friend and former colleague, that's the case. If his analysis is based on some rather casual assumptions that if you have a free trade agreement with another partner, then you already have free trade, so what's the additionality? As I said in my comments, there's a great deal of additionality because all free trade agreements aren't the same. So that's only one example. And I assume if there was time for a closer analysis, assessment of the agreement, it would be worth, he would spend more time and probably come up with a different conclusion. To help him, one of the things that we are going to do as soon as the TPP text is completed and released is we're going to do with a team of scholars, do a quick assessment of the key components of the TPP so that we did the same thing during the NAFTA debate more than 20 years ago. And that way we hope to help inform the public debate going forward on TPP soon after the text is completed.
I just want to throw in, part of my job is to do advertising. This is a very exciting project that Jeff is leading for us. We've brought in international legal scholars. We're bringing back in Peter Petrie, I believe, to do simulation analysis. We're going to go really deep. And we're going to be very open and honest about it. And obviously, if we come out in ways that are not as favorable as we might think going in, that's the reality. We will not be providing any jobs numbers.
The gentleman in the back, sorry, you are the next.
Yes, Craig Sheffley from U.S. Labor Department. I'd like to explore Adam's observations about boogeymen from the past. I'm thinking about the 70s and 80s when Japan was sort of flooding the U.S. market with chips in cars, and that issue was very much in rage. And how are things different today? I talked to people who went through that period, and they remember, and they say, how is it going to be different this time around? Will Japan be opening up its economy and be willing to make the reforms? I mean, Adam mentioned about in agriculture, but yet there are other behind-the-border measures which involve high regulation. And the question is, how will that openness come if Japan makes the commitment, or will it be able to make that commitment?
When we talk about policy on trade, Greg, let's try to keep certain facts straight. That it is possible for damages to be done in a particular industry or to a particular company without it actually being terribly meaningful as a policy issue for the country as a whole, or even for that industry as a whole. So you say, how are things different today? Well, we do have some documented cases in the 70s and 80s, which this institute in time did look at, where you had these surges of imports or dumping, and then we had, in Jeff and Gary's sort of bastard child, we had the anti-dumping rules in place to deal with those. But again, I want you to think about this from a dynamic point of view, meaning the multiple years in the development of the U.S. economy. Those chips that were so important, all of these Japanese chip makers are dead. We still have Intel at the high end of the chips, and now we have Koreans and others at the low end of the chips. Yeah. Fuji versus Kodak. Fuji supposedly killed Kodak with its dumping and its illegal behaviors. Oh, I'm sorry, I've offended you. You're coming back for more. But neither of them are still really in existence as film companies.
I'm not arguing that issue. I'm arguing about the reforms that can be made in Japan. I'm not talking about past history that way, but insurance and the Postal Service and other behind-the-border measures. Mm-hmm. Tariffs are not really a big issue.
Right.
But I'm talking about the opportunity for internal reform within Japan and the willingness and what makes things different today vis-a-vis that to counter that impression from the 70s and 80s when, in fact, the economy was perceived as being very closed to foreign entry.
As always, it will depend on how much Japan's government serves its own country's best interests versus serves particular corporate interests, just as in any country. The more they liberalize, the better it is for their country as a whole. And I'm not trying to be facile. I mean, we've seen this with Korea right now. So, there's a hell of a lot of complaints, which at least on my glance seems legitimate, but Jeff, again, knows far more than I do, that the Koreans have not been adhering to the spirit of KORUS. And there's certainly a lot of complaints on Capitol Hill about the way the Koreans have implemented KORUS. And this is in part because of screams from domestic political interests in Korea. And as a result, Korea hasn't gained as much. The average Korean person just hasn't gained. Greg, I don't know what to tell you. I just, that's what we have to see. But as Jeff says, changing the rules gives you a better chance of getting there.
Well, that last comment is the key one. The TPP has extensive rulemaking obligations, and Japan isn't the only player. There are many other countries that are adopting these rules. Korea has already adopted many of the rules that will be in TPP because TPP has drawn extensively from the experience of the KORUS. There are some areas of implementation problems with KORUS, but the vast majority of the new rulemaking is being adhered to. But obviously, for Congress, before going ahead and accepting making additional commitments to Korea, they want to make sure the previous deal has been fully and faithfully implemented. So that's the focus of those deliberations. But in the context of Japan, the disciplines on state-owned enterprises are important. The related investment and competition rules in TPP, and these are being adopted by many countries that have similar competitive industries, which will benefit from the greater pressures from competition that spur innovation. Japan can't afford to be isolated from this, and I think there will be a great incentive to if Japan signs on these rules as a whole package, then it'll be a big boost moving forward and eliminating a lot of the problems. But no guarantees in life that everything will be faithfully implemented, and that's why we have enforcement provisions in the agreements to ensure constant monitoring and, if need be, remediation.
Fred, would you like to make a comment or a question? So could I let this gentleman up front to ask question first? Thank you.
Speaking of Korea.
That's right. I don't intend really to speak of Korea, but I did intend to ask about ISDS. Adam, you mentioned that there was a very long negative article in the op-ed in the New York Times today about it. Recalling the chorus negotiations, ISDS became very controversial in Korea, but as far as I recall, not in the United States. This time it seems to be controversial in the U.S. I guess the question is to Jeff, what has changed? Is it the same, roughly the same provision, or have just the politics changed?
Actually, investor state dispute settlement provisions have been controversial for the past 20 years. They were in the NAFTA, and environmental groups were concerned about whether the possibility of having access to such litigation would create incentives for regulators to go slow on new regulation. The experience of NAFTA, as Gary Huffbauer and I have documented in our comprehensive assessment of NAFTA's first decade and even beyond, is that didn't happen. There have been a number of cases, but they did not lead to very significant changes. And indeed, the New York Times article today mentioned one of those cases, which was a very high-profile case and raised the ire of many environmental groups. But when the tribunal finally reached its decision, they said no. And there was no action taken against U.S. policy. So I think part of the problem here, and it's a big problem in Europe as well in the context of the transatlantic trade negotiations, is that there is a confusion about what these types of procedures are meant to protect. They're not meant to enforce the agreement. They are meant to provide remedies in the case of expropriation. Now, there are cases of expropriation that are very clear, such as when a government just takes over property, as Argentina has done, as Ecuador has done against Occidental Petroleum. And indeed, that has always been the subject of demands for compensation, fair compensation, in any bilateral economic arrangement. The Times article confuses that with the other issue, which is indirect expropriation or regulatory taking, where a change in policy, in regulatory policy, which is intended to basically usurp indirectly the value of the investment by rendering the activity uneconomic or making it illegal. That happens on rare occasions, but it does occur, and there needs to be the opportunity to have an adjudication of that. Sometimes domestic courts in the United States or elsewhere can be biased for the domestic interest. And for a fair hearing, investors want the added security of knowing that there will be a level playing field. U.S. investors have benefited greatly from that. Now, the last point on this is there have been significant changes since the NAFTA provisions to take account of the experience of the ISDS process and to provide needed safeguards against abusive or frivolous litigation. These have been included in amendments in the NAFTA agreed to by the NAFTA ministers. And in the context of the TPP And I suspect in the transatlantic context as well, negotiators are thinking of additional safeguards and possibly even an appellate process to ensure that there aren't sort of rogue panels that go off the rails. This was a subject in the EU-Canada free trade agreement that where ISDS was controversial as well, and the negotiators reached a series of additional safeguards which may be worth looking at in terms of setting precedents to help address some of the concerns of critics who have the right objective of ensuring that regulations can proceed uninhibited in protecting public health and safety, but perhaps have been overly critical of this process in the context of the trade agreement.
So, Fred, thanks for waiting.
No problem. Question for Admiral Blair. I, like all my colleagues here at the Peterson Institute, are huge supporters of the TPP. We're confident that it will have positive effects on the U.S. economy. But we also know that the U.S. economy is very big, and so the economic effects on us will be small. And we also know that a lot of members of Congress have doubts about those benefits. Paul Krugman notwithstanding, they have a lot of doubts anyway. So, like most trade agreements in the past, this one will essentially have to pass muster and be supported on foreign policy and national security grounds. Indeed, we know that's why President Obama re-engaged the U.S. in TPP in the first place, as he interestingly indicated this week in his eulogy for Lee Kuan Yew, who had a big effect in encouraging him to do so. My question to you is whether you think at this point in time the Congress will be responsive to that foreign policy and national security argument, essentially the rebalancing toward Asia, the overall case that you made in your remarks today. What's your sense? Will that be well received in the Congress, sufficiently to carry the somewhat uncertain nature of the economic debate and to pull through the kind of eventual majority and support that's going to be required?
Well, I would. I've met with both Senator Hatch and Senator Wyden on the issue, so I get a pretty good view of it. And what I generally get, Fred, is not much of an argument on the national security interests, and then, however, but I have to deal with my constituents in this particular area. So you can almost see them weighing what they know in their heads is the greater good and is probably the right thing to do for the country, along with, but how much of my political capital can I spend on it, still be reelected next time, and not alienate parts of those who voted for me. So on those who are key and in the middle, I don't get a lot of argument on the national security side. I get these doubts on the other side. What I can say in small. Are we off the record here or on the record? We're on the record. On the record. Okay. Let me phrase it this way. Let me phrase it. The United States in 1990, when the Soviet Union gave up. Yeah, we partly beat them, but mostly they beat themselves. And we found ourselves at this pinnacle of military, economic power, political prestige, and so on. And those of us who were, I remember I was SINCPAC as a hyperpower, and it didn't feel quite as kryptonite free as one would have thought. But I think most of us recognize that was an anomaly. That kind of happened. We got lucky. And although American power since then has, in fact, in absolute terms, increased in many, many important ways, the oil shale boom, the innovation in the IT sector. I mean, this is the armed forces themselves are far more capable than they were back then. Our relative power has declined. There's no getting around it. It's not because we're standing still. In fact, we're getting better. It's that other countries have closed this artificial gap. So the real challenge is, how is the United States going to handle matters of leadership and position at a time when its relative power is less than it was in the days when it could simply dominate by force of military superiority, economic weight, and so on. And the answer is to have a more networked approach and less of a hub and spoke. We decide in Washington and tell everybody what to do. And a large component of that is trying to foster the development of general rules, which all countries in the world will more or less follow. All of these are imperfect because they see them as in all of their in all of their interests. And this goes across multiple fields, whether it be things like counterterrorism, nonproliferation, through the economic field when it comes to things like TPP. And so I think that, you know, the larger national security significance of what we're trying to do is set up a system that will be, to a certain extent, self-governing, much more self-governing, ultimately in our interest overall, maybe not on each little individual issue affecting a particular district or factory, or maybe even some of us personally. And I think in my conversations with Congress, I can see them sort of struggling with that feeling that this is probably a good thing to do. This is probably the right thing for the region in the case of the TPP and the United States in that partner. But boy, I do have these couple of tough things to go. And so you know, where will it go? You know, depends what sort of faith you have. But I think we'll come through. I hope so.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Panga with Xinhua Liu Agency. I'm wondering, could the panel comment on the prospect for the Trade Promotion Authority in Congress? I think there is some speculation that Japan has failed to deliver agricultural market reform, probably because Obama administration doesn't have Trade Promotion Authority in hand. So do you think the passage of TPA will become a precondition for conclude the TPP negotiations? Thanks.
Well, I think the Obama administration has made it very clear that they would like to see the passage of Trade Promotion Authority before the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, recognizing that Congress has constitutional authority in this area, and they would not want to do anything to even give the appearance of preempting that. That said, the administration is working very closely with the leadership in the Congress to try to expedite the drafting and consideration of TPA legislation in the coming month or two. I think the latest reports are, Admiral Blair has been talking to the principals, that there is just one small aspect of a very large piece of legislation that is still open, and the leaders of both parties are talking about whether they can reach an accommodation so that there is strong bipartisan support when the legislation is tabled. I think hopefully that can occur in the very near future, perhaps right after Easter break, and that would allow time for the Congress to deliberate on this legislation and send it to the president, pass it and send it to the president well in advance of the time that one would expect the negotiators to get near the final stages of or putting the final agreement together. So I think if you want my guesstimate of the timeline, substantial progress on the TPA legislation in May, and helping to propel the final negotiation of the TPP over the summer.
As is my role, I'll be one notch less nuanced, more crude than Jeff, just so that the message doesn't get lost. Jeff is absolutely right. The TPA is being driven by the domestic discussion in the U.S. and the attempt of both parties' leadership in good faith with the Obama administration to come up with something that gets a plurality in both parties. The TPP is by design right now, in reality, contingent on Japan delivering on agriculture, okay? If the U.S. comes close or passes TPA, then there is no excuse. The ball is totally in Japan's court. If and when Japan delivers on agriculture, then you start a cascade of going to the Canadians and then opening up markets for some of the developing countries in the TPP negotiations who can then sell into Japan and U.S. And that's the way the deal gets done. And so, yes, it is, TPA is not contingent on the agriculture, but TPP, in my view at least, and I think the Obama administration would largely agree, is dependent on Abe delivering.
Thank you. We are almost towards the end of the session, so if you don't have any other questions, I'd like to conclude, and please join me in thanking all these wonderful presenters. Thank you so much.
Just a final logistical thank you. There are many, we've had people in and out all day because it's been a very rich and dense program, but I want to thank in particular our colleagues at Sasakawa who've helped us put this together today, our friends at McKinsey Global Institute who provided some very exciting, fresh new substance this morning, our colleagues at the IMF Japan desk who continue to do high-quality work and presented some very interesting new work on corporate governance in Japan and its need for reform, and of course all my colleagues at the Institute, including the people who run the meetings, colleagues like Jeff and Lindsay Oldensky. Just to let you all know that we have two very important additional meetings coming up. On Monday, April 6th, going back to where we started talking about what the private sector could do, we will have an event on private sector initiatives to raise wages in the U.S. There will be a set of analyses by Justin Wolfers and Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute, as well as representation from people a little further out the political spectrum, and a luncheon speech by Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, who took that initiative for his workers. On Tuesday, April 7th, we will be having our semi-annual Global Economic Prospects presentation under the leadership of David Stockton, talking about the U.S., Jacob Kierkegaard talking about the upside in Europe, and importantly, of course, Nick Lardy talking about how real and permanent is the slowdown in China. So we hope you'll join us on those occasions. Thank you again for your participation today.